slightly late. Welcome to our second annual climate webinar. It's a webinar specifically about climate state policies and solutions. I'm Dominika, Parry, and I'm going to be your moderator tonight. As most of you know, I'm the founding president of 2C Mississippi. It's a local nonprofit organization. We work both on climate education and climate action. And we are a local host for this webinar. This is a national and actually this year international event organized by Solve Climate by 2030. That is an organization which mission is exactly that, get climate action in place by 2030. This event is live with over 125 universities participating. The ones that are foreign, I think, are going to be going live tomorrow because of time differences. In addition to majority of those 125 universities being from the United States, we also have participants from Bangladesh, Brazil, South Africa, Kyrgyzstan, Australia, Malaysia. The list is very, very long. We are very excited to be part of this event. As you may notice, we are not a university. We are the only participant the only local host who is not a university. So if anybody who is listening is part of university and would like to cooperate with us hosting such event next year, please do contact us. In the meantime, we will turn into the national organizers. They sent us a short message that put this event in perspective.
Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 U.S. states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Eben Goodstein, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness? Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much-needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the two hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon-neutral economy, while the U.S. rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class? The teacher can assign tonight's webinar's homework for the students and then afterwards have a one-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate project has easy-to-use teacher's guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes and thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forwards, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
Now I would like to welcome Dr. Alan Penman. Dr. Penman is a physician, epidemiologist, biostatistician, working on, in general, public health issues, but also lately focusing on the impacts of climate change on human health. He holds a degree from Aberdeen University Medical School from Scotland, Masters of Science in Clinical Tropical Medicine from London University, England, MPH from the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and a PhD in Biostatistics from University of Mississippi. He's been studying a lot. He is currently a professor at the Department of Preventive Medicine at the University of Mississippi Medical Center in Jackson. And I'm very proud to say he's also a board member of 2C Mississippi. Alan, back to you.
All right, so thank you, Dominika. Let me take you quickly through some of the work that we've been looking at or working on in Jackson. First of all, a little bit of science, not too much. Here we are we're at the wrong end of this upward trend in global average surface temperatures. So you can see how much they've risen since this baseline of this period, 1950 through 1980. It's gone up by, well, we're now over 1 degree Celsius in about 60 years. And so I think everyone's familiar with this now. It's not so much the amount of temperature rise, it's the speed or the rate at which this is occurring, which is alarming a lot of scientists. And here's an important point. You know, this figure shows that basically all the models that have been done for the past several decades have been pretty much spot on. So if you look at the actual temperature changes in red over this period from 1970 through current year, and then look at that, how well it correlates with the black line, which is the sort of average of all the different models, and the spread or the variation in the models is shown in blue. So what the models have done is they're pretty accurately predicting what's happening. So we've just, seen this steady, slow but steady warming pretty much all over the globe, although it has been more pronounced at the North Pole. And you can find lots of good websites. Now, here's an example, which I'm not going to go into, but there are plenty of these good websites which show this quite dramatically. And the important point is, it's not just an increase in the average temperature everywhere. It's a shift in the distribution. The whole system is resetting. It's moving upwards or to the right, which means that we're going to get a lot more days up here of extreme heat. And so the past 5 years have been the hottest 5 on record for the second year running. This is already out of date. I think 2020 is going to be up there as well when we get the data. And to put it in perspective, this compares the sort of year-on-year variation with this pre-industrial baseline, which is 1880 through 1910. And you can see these are our top 5 recent years. It doesn't necessarily mean that each year is going to be warmer than the next. So you can see here 2016 still holds the record, but it was actually in the early part of that year hitting 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. So again, as I say, 2020 is going to be up there as well. And, you know, these numbers may not seem large, but that's a huge increase in the system's average temperature. And that is why we're seeing these heat waves more and more now, more and more frequently. The most recent famous one, deadly one, was in July 2 years ago, when 2019, when it hit Northern Europe, particularly France and Spain, and there were somewhere between 30,000 and maybe as many as 70,000 excess deaths. Nobody actually knows exactly how many, but it was pretty dramatic. Now for Jackson, there are some places where you can find projections for the increase in hot days. So here using a definition of 95 degrees, we can expect a steady increase to perhaps 58 days above 95 by the year 2030, which is really not that far away. And this doesn't really take into account humidity, and we all know how much more uncomfortable that makes it. And here's a very nice website from NOAA. I'm not going to run it here, but you can open this up and you can put in Jackson and it'll find Jackson. And then you can run from 1950 through the end of this century, 2100, and you can see how it'll show you how we're going to increase our number of hot days or extreme heat days, perhaps to as many as 130 by the end of the century. You know, and what is that? That's over 4 months of extreme heat. And this is a different estimate from a different group, and they projected how many cities would see an increase in days of 105 by 2050, middle of the century. And you can see Mississippi has 2 of these cities in the top 25, Pascagoula and Gulfport. What is this going to do to us? Well, we can expect a lot more, you know, illness and death from heat waves, from extreme heat days. And so there are a number of people, a number of groups trying to project and predict how many excess deaths we can expect to see. And it's a kind of rather imprecise estimate at the moment. It's a difficult thing to predict exactly. But they can predict that if we could limit this temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, we could avoid maybe up to 2,000 extreme heat-related deaths per city. So this is admittedly looking at the bigger cities like Miami and LA and Chicago and New York. These are the cities that are really going to suffer. But, you know, we can expect similar, maybe on a smaller scale, but similar problems here in Jackson. And this is a different group, different modeling estimates. And again, they're predicting upwards of several thousand, maybe up to as many as 13,000 excess deaths from extreme heat by the end of the century. And, you know, I always remind people and suggest they watch this documentary. There's also a book called Cooked. It's about this famous or infamous 1995 heat wave that hit Chicago and Wisconsin and caused something like, it says here, 300 excess deaths. By the time this was over, there were something like 700 to 800 excess deaths. The city was totally overwhelmed. The services were completely overwhelmed by this. And of course, many, if not most of these deaths were preventable. Now, why are cities hit so hard? Well, it's this effect called the urban heat island effect. So you've got all this concrete and asphalt reflecting heat. You've got air conditioners blowing out hot air, and you've got traffic. So you've got this perfect storm of creating hot air and retaining heat. Now, Jackson is not Chicago, but over the years, there's been an attempt to, sort of renovate and rebuild and redevelop the city, and people are moving back to live there. So we don't have a high residential population, but it is increasing. And of course, thousands of people work downtown already. So, we need to take note of that. That's what it looks like just now. And you can imagine that, we could easily get an urban heat island effect there. But it's not just a question of the downtown area, the inner city area. There are many parts within the city limits that have people who are vulnerable to the effects of extreme heat. It's not a kind of equal opportunity killer, if you like. It's a socioeconomic problem, because many households, many people, many families don't have air conditioning, or they don't like to run it because of the cost. Or they have systems which are old and not very efficient. And this kind of distribution, when you look at the city's racial distribution, we are one of the most segregated cities in the US, believe it or not. And these are the areas and these are the people that are going to be vulnerable to extreme heat, where there are large numbers of African-American people, low-income people, and so on. And what's being pointed out now, that many of these same areas are areas that were redlined back in the 1930s. The redlining refers to this practice of color coding areas of cities which were hazardous for real estate investment. So there was an attempt back in the days of the Depression to try and help people with refinancing of their mortgages. And a lot of cities got color coded, where these red areas and the yellow areas, this is from Jacksonville, Florida, but you can find these maps online, and this is the one for Jackson. I think it was from 1934, yeah. And so you can see these areas which were color coded red and yellow. C and D were hazardous areas for investment. And these have become the poorer areas with the low quality housing stock, the very areas that are going to be susceptible or vulnerable to extreme heat. And this practice continued for nearly 40 years. And no surprise, these areas are also tend to be located closer to highways or industrial areas. They don't have green areas, trees and parks. They're more concreted, and they look more like this rather than this area on the right. And again, where would you rather live? I mean, this is the kind of development we're talking about, where there's really been no investment, no improvement over the years. And when you do the heat mapping, guess what? These are the areas that retain the heat, and yet people do still live in these areas. One of the groups that has been really doing a sort of deep analysis of this is the group up in Oregon. And one of the authors on this paper, one of the lead authors, Vivek Candace, is actually a consultant on some of our projects. And they have found that, these areas, these redlined areas can be up to 7 degrees Celsius hotter than non-redlined areas. So it's quite a dramatic difference. And here you see it. They looked. They're up in Oregon State, where they're based, and they looked at Oregon, and here it's about 5 degrees hotter in the redlined areas compared to the A's and B's. So we have established a climate action group in the city, really led by Dr. Parry. So she's here, second from the right, standing by our Mayor Lumumba. And we have started working on a heat preparedness plan, trying to develop a plan for a contingency plan for what we would do or what the city would do in the case of a heat emergency. We have done some heat mapping with the help of Vivek Candace's group Kappa Strategies, who provided us with these simple instruments, and we put together a team of students from Jackson State and UMC, and we, in pairs, these guys drove around the city 3 times a day on a particularly hot day in late summer. And the Kappa group helped us. They did the analysis, and they've started producing these maps for us. So one for the morning, one for the afternoon, and one for the evening. And we can provide the link here. You can go online and look at these. And so we're still doing a deeper analysis, but it's kind of starting to show us which areas of the city heat up most and which areas of the city don't cool down overnight, which is important. And if you compare, for example, with the red-lined map from the 1934 time, you can see, this just refers to the smaller area of downtown Jackson. And already you can see there is a correlation with, between the red and yellow red-lined areas here and these areas within the downtown area. Now, the city's grown a lot over the years, of course, and so our heat map does extend quite a bit further out. But again, here's another correlation the other way. So the cooler areas are, Northeast Jackson, which is a totally different sort of economic breakdown. So we're working to develop, ideas of which areas and which population groups are the most vulnerable to this, and trying to plan ahead. And now let me just quickly go through some of the heat mitigating strategies that we're thinking of developing. An obvious first one is to increase what's called the albedo effect, the amount of reflectance, where we really would like to have better reflecting surfaces. And there are a number of places which are kind of experimenting with this, a number of groups promoting this, using specially developed paints for roads and roofs. So this might be something that we could use. We have to be careful that it doesn't affect the, the flow or absorbance of water in heavy rain, things like that. That's certainly a nice idea that we could consider. Another one is to use, just having more shade. Some cities even have air-conditioned bus stops, or they have misting areas for people to walk through. There's certainly lots of technology here. Something that we're very interested in, very excited about, is the potential of developing green infrastructure. Now, this is not a real city, but this is a sort of ideal of what it could look like. And so we're now beginning to explore some of these options. Vegetation has just a huge effect by lowering surface temperatures, as you can see in this color-coded map, where the hot areas are not greened and the greened areas are quite a bit cooler. I mean, it's a dramatic effect. Greening doesn't just reduce temperatures, it removes air pollutants, it has thermal effects inside the buildings, it improves biodiversity, absorbs rainwater, reduces noise, and so on and so forth, apart from just an aesthetic benefit as well. And I'll come back to roof gardens at the end of this. Green infrastructure developments also include things like this: greening over parking lots, as you see here, greening medians, and creating what are called green corridors, where people can bike and walk. And how that looks really nice. I mean, I'm sure it has tremendous cooling benefit. And the important point is to try and connect areas of the city like this so people can get from place to place and stay in the shade. You can go vertical. You can have actually vertical gardens. And again, greening a vertical surface, has a tremendous reduction on the temperatures. Here are some examples from other places. I think many of these are from Barcelona, Spain, where we've been looking for ideas, and you can see how attractive this can be, as well as functional. And here, if you look from top left down to bottom right, this is the Faradays garden in Barcelona, and you can see how they've developed this over the years so that it looks like this on the bottom right. And, you know, this is a very attractive thing. It can become a tourist attraction, and it can be very pleasant for the people, of course, living there. And it can be made to be self-sufficient. It can be designed, for example, here with solar panels which run pumps, which run the watering. So it sort of takes care of itself. And downtown, it can be lit up like this, and so it can be a great attraction for visitors and tourists as well. And so that would benefit the city as well. Back to green roofs. So you can make those green gardens as well as just greening them for cooling. And people in various places have already done this. And it does make, as I said before, a tremendous difference, tremendous cooling benefit. And so it's something we are certainly going to be looking at a lot. And one final thing is, I mentioned green roof gardens, but greening the urban areas generally is a great idea because it can include community gardens. And for inspiration, we've looked at Cuba, particularly Havana, which for political reasons years ago was forced into developing its home food production. And so something like 90% of the island's fresh fruit and vegetables are now produced in these urban or peri-urban gardens. And, you know, we do have a small number, I think, of community gardens in the urban area here in Jackson, but we really want to promote these and develop these. And so these can be a very nice, very important sort of benefit of greening the city generally. And I'll just finish by mentioning this, and this is actually one of the most important points, is we're not just going to take, you know, do this to people. This is going to be a bottom-up kind of development. We're going to go to initially 2 or 3 select areas or neighborhoods in Jackson, and we're going to present these sort of ideas to them and get their input and their buy-in so that they can be an integral part of developing the sort of package of green interventions that they like and that they want for their neighborhood. So we're going to be working with the city through partners to go to communities and work with them to develop green infrastructure. Okay, that's pretty much what I wanted to say. So I'll stop sharing there. Dominika?
Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. And now what we would like to think about is all of these great ideas, which we're already in the process of developing, need to be financed. And these are not small amounts of money that are needed to actually go ahead. So this is a great segue to our next presenter. Dr. Partridge is the U.S. Market Coordinator for the Climate Bonds Initiative. She coordinates the entire market in the United States. She has a PhD from University College London, where she focused on the use of green bonds to finance more sustainable infrastructure for cities. Exactly what we are trying to do in Jackson and hopefully other cities in Mississippi. She has also done postdoctoral research on the financial aspects of plastic waste management and infrastructure. This research was done at UCL Plastic Waste Hub. She is currently doing further research into the green municipal bond market, specifically in the US, along with volunteering as a policy liaison for the Citizens Climate Lobby, and very recently serving on the board of 2C Mississippi. Candace.
So Dominika asked me here to talk to you guys about green banks, because there's this great big question about all the things we'd love to do in Mississippi and how we are going to pay for them. So this talk is about a green bank for Mississippi, how to grow a more sustainable economy for our state. As we're all more than aware, we have an extremely high poverty rate relative to the rest of the country of about 20%. And yet at the same time, our power bills in Mississippi are higher than usual. And this is because we actually have a low levelized cost of energy in Mississippi, thanks to TVA. But our power consumption is significantly higher per capita than most other states, largely due to, like Alan was discussing, heat stress and having to run our air conditioners more than the usual American. As a result, we're having to pay more per capita for our electricity usage. Yet at the same time, we rank 31st in solar installations. We're literally throwing money away. Look at our solar irradiance. We could really do a lot more with this. And as you can see, even compared to the rest of the Southeast, we're behind the curve. Look at Mississippi. It's a bit of a hole in terms of solar installations currently in ground. Look at Georgia, look at Florida. They're really kind of taken off there. So this whole question is, what can we do to fix this? How can we pay for this? What can we do to get Mississippi to catch up in general? The US is actually doing pretty well in terms of financing renewable projects, even though we don't have a federal mandate still. This is kind of looking to change, as I'm sure we're all aware, during the administration shift. Biden is talking about bringing in an infrastructure plan that contains a huge tranche of money for renewables and energy efficiency. The problem is there's no oversight over the existing pipeline in terms of who is building what, and how is that coming down the pipe, and who's going to get the money for it. Energy projects, especially renewable energy projects, are very small and they're kind of like bits and pieces. They're hard to finance at scale. Utility scale solar and wind are much easier to finance because they're just large projects. You can essentially take them to bank much more easily. Cash flows are much more stable. But when we're talking about small solar projects, rooftop solar, community solar, this is a lot more difficult to get together. As a result, we need something to overcome these barriers. This brings up the idea of a green bank. So what is a green bank? Green banks are essentially like infrastructure banks that are public-private partnerships that enable a state or some other metropolitan authority to be able to coordinate with the finance system. And essentially they raise capital as seed capital for renewables and energy efficiency projects, and then use that capital to leverage private financing, and then coalesce the pipeline of projects that want to be financed into like one streamlined pipeline, and then go ahead and roll out the financing to each of the projects. Green banks are really highly efficient in terms of capitalization. If $1 of investment through public funds through a green bank can raise $4 in private capital. So this is a 4-to-1 ratio. So essentially, if Biden's infrastructure plan brings in $1 billion for investment in green banks and then ultimately into renewables, this will also, by definition, bring in another probably $4 billion on top of it, because the private capital is seeking to marry up with the public capital. So they essentially act as sort of matchmakers between public and private finance, specifically for sustainable infrastructure. This isn't a new thing. I mean, it's new to Mississippi, obviously, to be thinking about this, but the truth is, this is pretty well established. I actually live in New York, and New York has the New York Green Bank, which is extremely well established. It was one of the first in the country. The Connecticut Green Bank is also a very well established green bank. There are more popping up every single year. And since they haven't really been around very long, this has been, recent days, but as you can see, the investment that's being leveraged by these green banks is really increasing exponentially year on year. And the types of projects they finance, I love this slide because 34%, a whopping whole third of this, it goes to community solar, which is exactly the sort of projects that we need in Mississippi. This isn't just about big utility scale projects. This isn't just about rooftop solar. This is about bringing community solar projects to our neighborhoods. But it is also about energy efficiency in multifamily homes and getting people better insulation and better windows and better HVAC systems. We can cover all of these things through green banks, and they're all equally necessary. The other beauty of green banks is that they have a mind towards social equity. So 40% of investment is made to disadvantaged communities. And a key aspect of green banks is that when it creates investment in green infrastructure, it also creates green collar jobs. And these are generally local jobs. So this is really important, especially in the context of Mississippi, where we desperately need local jobs. So a green bank can lower your utility bills, create new businesses, create new jobs, and improve public health. These are the benefits. There we go, I just said it myself. And where I get really interested about this is about the potential to grow the state green municipal bond market. Connecticut has done this. Connecticut has recently issued, they did this last year, they call Liberty bonds, green Liberty bonds. Most municipal bonds are issued in denominations of $5,000, so that if you want to buy municipal bonds, you have to lay out $5K. They decided to denominate them in smaller chunks, so $1,000. So if you have $1,000 and you want to invest in sustainable infrastructure for your own community and you live in Connecticut, this is super easy. You just wait for the green bonds to be released as Liberty bonds. You can buy in, and they all finance, it's basically aggregated rooftop solar projects. So it's all residential rooftop solar. So you know that if you want to sustainably invest your money into sustainable projects, this is a very straightforward way to do it. And it's very low risk, because municipal bonds are they're low risk, low return, but definitely low risk. And you're investing in your own local community. I'd love to see a program like this for Mississippi. This way we can take our money and invest it in our home state and try to get it to grow in the way that we want it to grow. And particularly green collar job creation, Mississippi jobs for Mississippians. Because think about it, if you're putting solar panels on people's roofs or in the ground, you're going to have people that are local electricians coming to do this. Please forgive the noise in the background. I have a toddler. Manufacturing is one of the key industries that is stimulated by the instantiation of green banks. We have installation, repair. There's also, more skilled jobs, management, professional jobs, sales jobs. I mean, come on, this is going to be a huge industry. Putting solar panels on people's rooftops is a very big sales industry. So these are jobs that they cut across all socioeconomic classes, and this is something we definitely need in Mississippi. What can we do to support this? So if you hear anyone talking about, we need jobs for Mississippi, or I wish Mississippi had this, I wish Mississippi had that, voice your support for, this is the Clean Energy Accelerator Act. This is essentially Biden's infrastructure plan. It includes a huge stimulus package for the establishment of state green banks. This is something that would directly benefit Mississippi. We should be really fed up of being left behind, and this is a door that can be opened to us. Follow the Coalition for Green Capital. I know that many of you on this are my fellow CCL people. Coalition for Green Capital is something I wish CCL would also push and try to get co-sponsored along with our bill. They are advocating for state green banks for every single bank. And of course, they are the source of many of these slides and a huge wealth of information. And in general, regardless of your stance on the infrastructure plan or how you feel about green banks, be a vocal advocate for more sustainable energy projects in Mississippi. My mom is constantly sending me news clippings from Lowndes County, where I'm from, about solar panels, solar farms going in ground. She sent me a news clipping of a new wind farm in Tunica in the Delta. I mean, there are glints of really interesting growth happening in Mississippi. So be an advocate for that. I don't want to hear about birds and wind turbines. Basically, I don't want to hear about how expensive things are. Be an advocate. These people are trying their best to get an industry started that will benefit all of us. And then finally, again, if you're in CCL, you were totally used to this message, please write and call your representatives and senators Tell them that you support renewable energy infrastructure. Tell them that you support the establishment of a state green bank. Tell them that you want to see green collar jobs in Mississippi. Tell them that you want to get ahead of the curve, that we want to be involved in this industry from the get-go. And we don't want to be left behind anymore. Mississippi does have a wealth of energy potential and skills potential, and we need to put these two things together and build a better state for the future. And I think that is basically all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Candace. This was wonderful. Our next panelist is Robert Wiygul. Robert Wiygul is an attorney and partner at the Waltzer and Garside law firm with an office here in Mississippi in Ocean Springs. Robert has been practicing law for 32 years, spent sometimes in Louisiana and Colorado, but a lot of it in Mississippi. And in his practice, he focuses on environmental issues, but not only. He's been involved in issues of saving endangered species, of stopping corporate polluters, of protecting public lands, but also in helping injured workers get justice. He won many spectacular cases. There's one specific that is spectacular, and it's incredibly relevant to what he is about to talk about and what we are all really, really interested in. It's a case that took 5 years, and it's a landmark litigation. It was against Mississippi Power's Kemper County coal plant. Most of us know exactly what this case was. Robert represented the Sierra Club, and they won $15 million settlement. And that specific settlement is going into solar investments. Solar investments, mostly at schools, probably only at schools, for low-income communities. This need for investment is closely linked to ability of making those investments in a cost-effective way, for which we need to change the laws that we right now have at the state level. This is what Robert is going to be talking about today. Robert?
All right, thank you, Dominika. So I am talking to you from Ocean Springs, Mississippi, which is right down on the Gulf of Mexico, about 80 miles to the east of New Orleans. And as it happens, it's right between Gulfport, Mississippi and Pascagoula, Mississippi. So I'm coming to you from one of those top 25 places for bad news and climate change tonight, live. And believe me, down here, climate change is not a theoretical issue. We're looking at sea level rise, we're looking at warming Gulf waters with increasing intensity of tropical cyclones, and we're looking at change in precipitation patterns in the Midwest that come down the Mississippi River that affect the Gulf of Mexico. So it is something that is right there in front of us. Now, what I'm gonna talk to you about tonight is this, right? So we know what Dr. Penman gave us a great summary of what's happening. We know it's happening despite a few naysayers. The scientific consensus is there. In fact, there's a strong consensus in the US public for action to control climate change. Polling from Pew Charitable Trust shows that that is something that enjoys substantial support out there. And we know, for example, the National Academies Press just came out with a publication that pretty much says we understand what the near-term actions, the next 10 years, that we have to take to start to do something about this and to try to meet or at least mitigate the damage that we're doing here. And those include increasing the share of electricity on our grid produced by renewable non-carbon emitting sources. So how do we do that, right? And how do we do that in a way that takes into account some of the things that Candace and Alan talked about here earlier? You're in a place like Mississippi, where we've got high poverty rate, we got high energy burn. We have high annual energy costs. We have a climate in the summertime, sometimes in the wintertime, that means that climate control in houses is a matter of health of human life. How do we do something when we've got a population that's vulnerable and we're supplying them with affordable electricity is a public health and safety issue? So this is where we, as my father would say, this is where we get the feed down where the hogs can get at it, right? This is where we actually do something and get something in place out there to put some solar panels on roofs and do whatever else we can do there. So one way that we do that is through a framework called net metering, which most folks are pretty familiar with. So let's define a couple of terms to get started here. Distributed generation is generally talking about putting the equipment that generates electricity out there close to the place where it's going to be used, or out there on the system. So it's differentiated from what's really been the model for the last 120 years here in the United States of building very large coal-fired, other fossil fuel-fired or hydropower facilities that generate a whole bunch of electricity. And net metering deals with a kind of a subset of distributed generation. It's generally thought to apply to homeowners, although it certainly applies to businesses and anybody that's got a building or another place that they can put generation. Right now, it is typically used to refer to solar installations, although it certainly could bring in wind, it can bring in hydrogen, it can bring in any of the emerging technologies that we use. And increasingly, we're talking about how to integrate storage with distributed generation and the net metering system. All right, so it's a great idea, right? You get generation out there, distributed around, close to where people use it. It's non-carbon emitting. It's good for us. How do we get there? How do we get to a policy that is going to make that happen? Now, to understand that, you got to understand a little bit about how this system works. And it's political here in the United States. Net metering policy, for the most part, is made at the state level by entities called public service commissions, public utility commissions, or something along those lines. These are frequently elected bodies, and they exist to, generally speaking, they exist to deal with regulated monopolies like electric utilities or gas transmission systems and telecoms in many cases, things of that nature. So these public service commissions came out of the utility and electric distribution model of the late 19th, early 20th century United States, where electric distribution was treated as something that was appropriately considered a regulated monopoly to avoid overlap and wasteful spending on infrastructure and things of that nature. So that's what the commissions have been doing in the electric arena all these years, is dealing with regulated monopolies. And of course, we have a whole bunch of different kinds of those. We have investor-owned electric utilities under great big giant holding companies like the Southern Company. We have cooperatives that are, in theory at least, are owned by their customers, and which may have their own generation facilities or may just buy electricity from other sources. We have deregulated states like Texas, of course, where we have all sorts of models, and then we have some things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is quasi-governmental and owns a great deal of infrastructure. So you got all those things, and the commissions are taken care of. And then in the last 30, 40 years, here comes the concept of homeowner-owned. Let's just stick with solar, right? homeowner-owned solar where you can make some of your own power, then maybe if you make too much power, you can send some of it back to the grid where someone else can use it. So what do you have to do to make that work? And it's, again, it's a great idea. There are recent studies that really are demonstrating the benefits to the grid of this kind of distributed generation. And those can include reducing line losses, the electricity loss on the system, the need to invest in additional very expensive infrastructure by the utility, which the utility wants to collect the cost out plus rate of return. It's customers, resiliency, and other things like that. So, but how do you get people to do it, right? And at its most simple, it's an investment decision, right? So you got a couple of things going on. This is oversimplifying it, but you've got the cost of equipment. How much does it cost you to get generation equipment on your house, or on your office building, or on your tool shed, wherever else you put it? And then you got how much you pay for electricity from the utility or whoever it is you're buying electricity from. Then, if you're going to be generating excess electricity, what are the terms on which you're going to put that power back on the grid, and what are you going to get paid for? Okay, so you put all those things together, and I guess the theory is, like Dominika's an economist here, Candace, you're in this, the theory is that those curves cross at the right place, everybody is going to say, I want one of those, because that's a good deal, right? That's what efficient markets theory applied to this sort of area. But it's a lot more complicated than that, because you got to go through this political process, and what comes out of there determines who's going to want to do this. So here's how it played out in Mississippi. Most states in the United States have net metering regimes of some sort. They differ a great deal in their approaches to each of those issues that we talked about, right? There are some places where you get a federal tax incentive and a state tax incentive to put on solar equipment. So that affects your cost of equipment, right? There are some places like Hawaii where base power rates are extremely expensive, and other places like in TVA territory where it's less expensive. So that affects the cost of power you're buying elsewhere. And then there's the question of what you get paid and how you get to put power back on the grid. Now, Mississippi was one of the last states to adopt a net metering grid. We did that in 2015. And this is an object lesson in how design can affect the adoption of these technologies. The Mississippi rule adopted a two-channel metering process. So what that means, right, is that you had basically two wheels on the meter at the house. One is when the electric utility sends you power, and that one clocks that. Then when you send power back to the grid, that one clocks that. So you pay the utility for the power they send you, and they pay you for the power that you send back. Now, the power going out to the grid under that rule was reimbursed at what's called avoided cost, and that's the utility's cost to get electricity, base cost to get electricity from another source. It's a good deal more complicated than that, but let's just use that now. So, Public Service Commission says you put power back on the grid, we're going to give you avoided cost plus 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour, which down here that's going to be maybe 5.5 cents kilowatt hour. Retail power with some, different elements or base charges that you have to pay, and charges for different times of year sometimes and stuff like that. It's going to run 10 cents a kilowatt hour, something like that. So, under that structure, which everybody really hoped was going to do something, nothing happened. There was extremely limited adoption in the hundreds out of many thousands of customers that were eligible for it. I was actually one of the people that did get an assistant. And, from an economic standpoint, it will pay out eventually. But it's going to be a long time for that to happen. And the rule simply was not successful in generating any reasonable level of adoption of distributed generation. So here we are. It's just about 5 years later, and the Mississippi Public Service Commission is revisiting that rule in a very changed landscape. One thing that's discussed earlier, I think public awareness of the necessity of addressing climate change issues and emissions related to fossil fuels is considerably higher than it was then. And the understanding of the necessity of putting substantial amounts of renewables onto the grid on a time frame that really starts now is better understood. And of course, the political situation since our last presidential congressional election is different than it was, and there's a lot more encouragement from the federal level of those things. So, what's happening now? Again, this is how these really good ideas get translated into policies that hopefully are going to make them work. What you have going on up at the commission, to its credit, has asked a series of questions to people who are interested in this. And that includes the electric utilities, environmental groups, people who work in the solar industry, community groups, and individuals. Asking a series of questions, right? Does the rule work? What do we need to do to make that rule work? What do we need to do to make this distributed generation net metering process available to low-income customers? Really easy. So that they're asking absolutely the right questions. You give them credit for that. And what renewable energy advocates are telling them are basically what you need to do is make sure that your reimbursement rates for people that are selling onto the grid, given the other factors at play, are sufficient that people are going to want to do this and are going to see benefits of it. And part of that question, of course, since, say a solar system for a decent sized house down here is going to run you $18,000, $20,000, $25,000. You're going to get some federal tax credit for that. But it's a big chunk of cash for people up front. Right? Most people are not going to be in a position to do that. So there needs to be policies in place and reimbursement systems in place that are going to allow those systems to be reasonably financed. The Commission is also looking at, and it had in its original rule an additional incentive payment for low-income customers. Again, that one, did not turn out to be sufficient to spur widespread adoption. To my knowledge, right now, only one low-income customer ever took advantage of that in the last 5 years. So that would need to be changed to really spur more widespread adoption. Now, so that's what renewable energy, folks that are concerned about climate change, they are telling the Commission, look at where those curves cross, right? Cost curve and the benefit curve, and see what it's going to take to get people to say, yeah, this is something that I can live with. And by the way, one really important thing also there is certainty, right? So if you're going to spend $20,000 or finance $20,000 to put on a solar system, you're going to want to know that the powers that be are not going to pull the rug out from under you on what you're getting for selling power back to the grid in 5 years or 10 years. You're going to want to have some consistency in that. So that's a very important element of that as well. Now, all these parties just yesterday actually put in substantial comments about all of these things. The investor-owned utilities, which generally speaking are not particularly fond of the whole net metering concept. They are regulated monopolies, and they make their money by investing capital and by selling electricity to consumers. And to the extent that people are generating it themselves at their house, they're not buying it from the utility. So the investor-owned utilities are arguing a number of things, that it's not as efficient as utility-scale solar and or other renewables. It's generally just not economically justified. And they also argue that net metering unfairly shifts costs to non-participants, because net metering customers don't pay as much to the utility and therefore don't pay as much to keep up with the transmission system. So these are all the issues that are going to be hashed out in the Mississippi Public Service Commission over the next 3 to 6 months, or even a year. And hopefully at the end of that process, we're going to have a rule that's going to make it much more attractive to put these non-emitting distributed renewable technologies out there on people's houses. But like I said, this is where the sausage gets made on getting these technologies adopted and getting that widespread penetration of renewables out there on the grid, that we've really got to see starting about right now if we're going to make a change in these things. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was great. I just have to add that Robert we wouldn't be able to do any of it without him. He is absolutely leading all the efforts, and we are extremely grateful. Well, now, if only my slides would move. Yes, now we will open up for a discussion. I would encourage everybody, I would stop sharing so we can see each other a little better. I would encourage everybody to type in questions in the chat. And the first question that we were asked before we get to the specific details would be a question that we were supposed to discuss. This was an ask from the national organizer. It is simple, but possibly the answer could be powerful. What can each of us, which of us being a student, a faculty, or just a community member, what can we personally do to get involved in the solutions that we've just heard about? How can we help advance them? How can we participate? What can we do to help? And maybe just for order, in the order we were speaking initially, everybody can say a few words related to their particular issue discussed. Alan was first.
Let's see. You know, I think one of the most important thing is just to be aware of what's going on. And particularly in the city, and particularly at the state level, although we're not actually working with the legislature, it's a little more challenging. But, you know, as Robert was talking about, and Candace mentioned this too, we need to advocate. We need to contact your legislator and say, you know, why is this not happening? Or, you know, can't you support this? Or this is a good idea. Other states have been doing it. You know, why aren't we doing it? I mean, it is ridiculous we don't have solar, widespread solar living in the South. I mean, it's just madness. So, you know, individually you can do small things, but I think we have to, you know, think big and stay aware and be active and call people up. Yeah.
Thank you. Candace.
Alan basically covered it, and I more or less covered it in my talk too. Like, basically, we need to become a nuisance to our local politicians, because Dominika and I have had the privilege of sitting in meetings with them and their staffers, and they'll say things like, oh, well, we haven't had any messages from our constituents. We haven't had any emails. We haven't had any phone calls. And, you know, seriously, I'm telling you, one phone call can count for like, I feel like 20 votes these days in Mississippi. I'm really bored of going into these meetings and being told that they're not hearing from their constituents about this. And this is very easily changed. Just go on Google, figure out who you need to speak to. I can name them and shame them, but I won't. And then pick up the phone. Even, you know, if you're scared of speaking to the staff, just call in the evening and leave a voicemail. It's all you have to do, and just give your zip code and just to prove that you're a constituent. It's really that easy. You don't even have to type anything. So if we don't do this, we're never going to get change in the state, because they are not motivated by anything except money and being reelected. That's it.
I agree. Robert.
First you educate yourself and then you advocate. And that, I cannot tell you how many times I've had politicians tell me nobody is calling me about it. And they, you know, surprisingly few people contact them about issues. And a couple of phone calls sometimes is enough to make them say, all right, I got to pay attention to this.
Yep, we got to get organized. Now we have a more specific question that came with Aidan, from Aidan. How can we follow the progress of the Utility Commission's decisions making over the next few months? You can call me, or Robert.
Okay, so there are participants in this proceeding, like 2C and Sierra Club and various local organizations, right? They can help you keep up to date. Public Service Commission is going to have a public notice about any new rule that they do that affects net metering, and there's going to be an opportunity for the public to be heard on that. Okay, so there haven't been many public hearings over the past year, but I think we're moving into a time when those are going to be happening. So there's going to be a chance for the public to be heard then. So watch the Public Service Commission website and get with 2C Mississippi, get with Sierra Club, get with Mississippi Audubon, get them to keep you up to date, because there's going to be a chance to talk directly to the Public Service Commission about what you'd like to see. And I will tell you, this Public Service Commission wants to hear from you. They want people to come and tell them what they think about this.
Thank you, Robert. I'm encouraging you again to send out more questions to all the panelists. In the meantime, there is a general question that I've been actually thinking about, as well as the whole group. How likely do we actually think that those solutions will become reality? I know what Alan was talking about is with relationship to particular projects that we are already working on, but then we have financing for developing those projects. We still don't have money for buying and planting the trees. Candace was talking about the future of green banking. How likely is it that we will be able to establish green banking? Robert was talking about spread of community solar and low-income solar investments. How likely is that to happen? How we are extremely far behind on solar market penetration. How do you see it changing, and as a result of the regulations, but also maybe influx of money? How do we practically see it in Mississippi, which is such an unusual state and does not necessarily follow the same federal patterns that we are hoping to observe in the future?
I'm going to go ahead and jump in with a disclaimer. I'm going to have to dip in a minute. I have a hard deadline, not just bedtime. So I think that this is one of these cases where federalism is a double-edged sword for America, where sometimes states have the ability through their own rights to get things right and get things wrong. And I honestly think it's going to take a federal mandate in order to establish a route of financing in order to bring Mississippi into 2021 or 2022 when this finally happens. So it could happen. I don't think Mississippi is going to do it on its own. It hasn't so far. It has no incentive to do so as long as our energy remains cheap. So all I have to say is, again, I implore you to lobby for yourself, both on the state level and on the federal level. And hopefully this administration, the national administration, can get this right, because the state administration shows no indications of doing anything productive on this front.
Dominika, I think we've lost your audio.
I'm sorry.
There you go.
Would you guys like to add to that? I know that, Robert, you have an extensive experience, which is probably extremely painful, working with state representatives. We actually, 2C Mississippi mostly works either with federal or with local, which has another set of obstacles and challenges. But at the state level, this is one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult state to work on anything climate change. What is your perspective on it from your extensive experience?
Well, I think in the near term, I think there is going to be movement towards something that encourages, on the most micro level, encourages better net metering policy, better distributed generation. Of course, it's going to take a lot more than that, right? It's going to take utility scale renewables. It's going to take community solar and all of those things. I think if we get carrots from the federal level, that's going to help a lot. I think that I'm actually somewhat optimistic, because one of the things that I've seen just in my lifetime, I'm 62 years old, and I saw attitudes change, and of course not perfect today, but things changed a lot in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And things changed very quickly on other issues like marriage equality in the early part of the century. And we reached a tipping point that, for whatever reason, was there. Things happen. And that's what I hope is going to happen here. And I've got two daughters, right, who are 20 and 23, and their generation is engaged, and they understand the issues, and they're trying to make things happen. And we support them and give them encouragement. Yeah, I think we have a shot.
Thank you. Alan, what do you think? You've been in Mississippi you're not Mississippian by birth, but I think you've earned your Mississippian citizenship. What's your experience? What's your view?
Well, you know what they say, I wasn't born here, but I got here as soon as I could. No, I think, and this is the same in health issues, I think the legislature is useless for this. And I think the action has to take place at the municipal level. So Jackson's a start, but whether it's on the coast with Robert, or whether it's Tupelo or Greenville or wherever, I think, and I've been I think probably the only encouragement has been the stuff we've been involved with here with the current mayor in Jackson. And we've had funding from several sources to develop the kind of projects we've been talking about. And I think if we can publicize that and get other cities interested, and then you have, again, there'll be maybe a tipping point, there'll be a sort of critical mass, of cities around the state who are really pushing hard. Maybe then the legislature will, start to move. But it may not even be so relevant then. I think if cities can develop their own projects, their applications for funding, and there's crosstalk, between them. I mean, I think that's the way to go. It's like the Clean Indoor Air Act, trying to ban smoking in public places, there still has never been a state law. And yet, some certain municipalities around the state have just moved forward on their own to develop that. And that was the way to go. And I think it has to be the same with this, at least to get the ball rolling.
And what do you guys think about the role of universities? We know that throughout the country, throughout the world, that's the sources of research that we are using, and it's extremely important to make sure that this research keeps going on. At the same time, what we are observing here in Mississippi, as you can see, we are the only state that does not have universities that are leading even a webinar. That is a reflection of a phenomenon. What is it? I think I have some idea what that is, but it's definitely interesting, I think, for people who are listening to us from other states or who will hear the recording. Why are we not having active involvement from universities? Shouldn't university be more politics independent, with independent financing? Why is 2C Mississippi a host in 2 consecutive years rather than a university?
I don't know. I mean, maybe it's too much a football state. I don't to be cynical.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, Dominika, I think we need everybody that's got moral authority and political authority and economic authority to step up. And includes universities.
I mean,
So
Dominika, I would love to see more academic input from universities and colleges, but on the other hand, I don't think the legislators care much about academic input. I don't think they have a high regard for science, still, especially down here. So it's a moot point. It'd be nice to have it, but, I don't know if it'll make a big difference apart from hosting webinars.
Well, what bringing in more climate education, which is also really lacking in our state, have an impact, or it's too late? Often when I talk about it, people will tell me, you're trying to talk to K through 12. By the time they are adults, it's over. Does it really make sense to invest in education?
I think that's important. Yeah, I think both junior and high school. Yeah, absolutely.
Robert, what's your feel?
I think education is absolutely critical at the earliest possible stage, and I think that's right.
Well, we are greatly encouraging everybody on the call and who is listening into the recorded version. If you are part of a university in Mississippi, please reach out to us. The more, the better. In the meantime, any more questions from those present right now? Well, if not, thank you so much thank you the panelists for participating and for sharing really quite important information and background on our unusual state. Thank you so much to the audience. Thank you everybody for your patience with technical difficulties. Next year, we're gonna have a huge university leading this webinar, and everything is gonna go very, very smoothly. In the meantime, try to get involved. Thank you so much for participating and have a great night.
All right, thank you everyone.